Hello there, I'm the Serial Plagiarist, and today I wanted to take a look at a very interesting YouTube video that screams that the uploader lives in the year 2012, with next to no regard for discussion around Star Wars since. Now, I've actually watched this channel quite a bit. His name's Brandy McNulty. But if there was ever a flaw with his writing advice channel, it's that he uses super streamlined, popular movies and shows as examples when discussing the do's and don'ts of writing. The problem I have with this is that it feels like a lack of sincerity on what Brandon personally enjoys about a story, and more just him using uncontroversial, universally acclaimed stories to use for the do's and don'ts about a story. Very rarely does he use an extremely specific, lesser-known story to prove his point, and instead goes for all the big favorites of all time, like The Godfather, Die Hard, the first two Terminators, etc. Now, I like Die Hard and Terminator as much as the next guy, but the fact that he constantly uses extremely popular and well-known movies, or sometimes the opposite, like for example The Room, to demonstrate good and bad, tells me that he's just going along with the mainstream, rather than making up his own opinion. This is especially true when it comes to how he talks about Star Wars. Given his way of presenting do's and don'ts, he is of course both a prequel and sequel hater, and I tend to dislike that demographic, because they usually criticize the prequels for completely insincere reasons, and dislike the sequels also for insincere reasons. I can tell you as a dedicated Star Wars fan that there is such a thing as not liking the sequel trilogy for the wrong reasons. I dislike the sequels because they are a complete disrespect of the source material George Lucas wrote, and have incredibly lazily written and rushed stories, and other reasons that are incredibly specific and in-depth. I feel like the average YouTuber without blunt honesty would criticize The Force Awakens, for example, for being unoriginal and for Rey being a Mary Sue, without going into the complete meat of the issue. Because the thing is, I don't think a lot of people truly understand why the unoriginality matters, or why Rey is a Mary Sue. I would like to get into a video that criticizes the sequels for the wrong reasons, or doesn't truly understand the issue, and comes across as a guy jumping on the mainstream filthy casual perceptions of the movies, rather than forming their own opinion. You'll see what I mean when I get into this video.
Get ready, because today we're going to talk about Phantom Menace and how its problems run much deeper than Jar Jar.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. This video has a very 2012 quality to it. I love how he just brings up Jar Jar and expects everyone to revel in disgust at the mere mention of the worst Star Wars character ever. Oldest jab in the book.
Last month, I did a video on how Jar Jar Binks failed as a comic relief character.
I really hope you didn't bullshit around and claim he was a racial stereotype in that video, because that nonsense has been disputed 1,000 times over.
All your characterizations are quite definite, aren't they? I mean, where did this one come from?
The movie is pretty neutral. It is in outer space. These are aliens. How in the world you could take an orange amphibian and say that he's a Jamaican? I mean, even the idea of taking his ears and calling them dreadlocks is kind of a strange stretch as far as I'm concerned. I mean, it's completely absurd.
And in preparation for that video, I rewatched episode 1 for the first time in forever.
So did I. Great film.
Now, I didn't expect it to be great, but I was shocked at how unbearable this movie is from start to finish.
I really like how he's just showing random clips like the epic climax of the movie, while saying the movie's so unbearable. Is the emphasis supposed to be on Kid Anakin piloting the Naboo starfighter? Because I swear people just forget that R2-D2 was helping him, and he wasn't just doing it solo.
Sure, Jar Jar is a problem.
At this rate, I'm getting sick of you bringing up Jar Jar frequently. It's clear you're just following in prequel haters' footsteps and going on and on about Jar Jar like he was everywhere. He wasn't. And there's a bunch of other characters to talk about, you know.
But to be fair, removing him or toning him down wouldn't have saved Phantom Menace.
I also never personally understood why people found Jar Jar to be the bane of their existence. Not only is he verifiably not a racial stereotype, people just made that up, but I always thought the hatred people had for Jar Jar stems from them wanting Star Wars to be like Terminator and take itself 100% seriously all of the time, which Star Wars is not. Star Wars is not a literal war film, and in fact, I think Jar Jar was used quite effectively in The Phantom Menace. He helps characterize Qui-Gon, as he brought him along despite being so annoying and clumsy. Which the thing is, the characters in-universe are oh so annoyed by Jar Jar antics as well. On top of that, he helps bring everyone together in the climax. I remember watching The Phantom Menace a million times over as a kid, and I never thought once that Jar Jar got in the way of the other characters whatsoever, or imposed himself too much on the story. I have to say that there's a real contrast between how kids watch this movie and how adults, particularly those who think Star Wars should be mature, see the movies.
There's a lot wrong with this movie. It's been bothering me, and I need to get it out of my system. So today we're going to look at 3 writing-related issues that wrecked Episode 1.
Can't wait.
First issue is overdone world building.
Man, complaining about one of the film's greatest strengths is quite ballsy.
When we talk about world building, we're talking about bringing a story's universe to life with carefully chosen details.
I'm curious on how The Phantom Menace could have possibly screwed this up.
Those details might involve the story's setting, its history, its populations, and its power structures, among other things.
Yeah, so far, by showing us brief clips that demonstrate all this, you're not off to a good start. Maybe you could have shown footage of a different movie with heavy world building instead of relying on The Phantom Menace's greatest strength.
When done right, world building should be a two-way street involving both the creator and the audience. The writer sprinkles in small yet critical details, and those details help the audience imagine a larger universe beyond what they see on the screen or on the written page.
I still don't see what The Phantom Menace did wrong. I swear this guy just assumes that everyone's already on the same page he is.
In short, world building makes a story feel larger than it actually is.
Why are you showing that clip of the movie? It does not help your point whatsoever.
Unfortunately, The Phantom Menace leans way too hard into world building. One thing people often criticize is the idea of midi-chlorians, which are the movie's explanation for how the Force works.
Oh boy, midi-chlorians. Perhaps one of the most cliché prequel criticisms, with Brandon here criticizing it the exact same way everyone else does.
Rather than allowing the Force to be this unique and spiritual energy field, Phantom Menace takes the magic away and reduces it down to a scientific concept.
Whenever someone uses the word magic to describe the Force, or the concept of the Force, I cease to take them seriously. The Force is not magic, and it doesn't work like magic. People just can't accept that not everyone can use the Force, that it's genetic just as much as anything else. Even in something like Harry Potter, which uses literal magic, they make it clear that not everyone in-universe can use magic. It's a rare genetic trait, if anything. I noticed that while reading the books, and it's a good point, because Star Wars as a universe still exists in practicality. So in short, the hatred around midichlorians is more of a perception about Star Wars, rather than something that actually exists in Star Wars. George had the concept in mind since the very beginning, and midichlorians themselves are inspired by what we humans possess, called mitochondria. Also, his critique on midichlorians is very bargain bin, non-specific jargon that tells me he has not thought about this topic whatsoever. He's just pivoting off of what other people said. And you know, I'm getting sick of this when it comes to Star Wars. If you're going to talk about any common criticism on any movie, please for the life of me, don't copy-paste what you hear about it. Actually think for yourself.
Not only are the info dumps themselves boring,
Another thing, prequel haters are terrible at explaining why The Phantom Menace in particular is boring. I used to watch this movie on repeat all the time when I was a kid, and the only reason I got sick of it was because I wanted to see what the next chapter had in store.
but they shut down the audience's imagination and make the Star Wars universe feel smaller.
I swear this all just revolves around the midichlorians, because midichlorians in particular do not make the universe feel bigger or smaller. They're in extra detail about measuring force sensitivity and the specifics on that. I even hear that in the Star Wars novels from the 90s, they also had a means of measuring the force. And I'm sorry, an incorrect perception about Star Wars. One's fantasy of tapping into the force at any moment does not make the Phantom Menace bad for shattering that misconception.
The other big world-building issue is the situation with the trade routes. If you remember, the Trade Federation drives the conflict when they blockade and later invade Naboo.
It's so simple and straightforward that it makes you wonder how people don't know what's going on despite that.
This is all part of Palpatine's plan to gain power, and while this doesn't necessarily make for a terrible plot,
it doesn't.
The world-building details become suffocating. Early on, we get too many details and not enough reasons to emotionally connect with what's going on.
I don't know about you, but the aura of mysteriousness around the blockade is what made me invested. The Jedi as the POV characters come in, and they slowly uncover a sinister plot to invade Naboo. That's how I saw the movie when I was a kid, and that's why the story worked for me. This guy says that they need to characterize different characters being affected by the blockade, but given the structure of the film, it's all in due time, as the point of view is emphasized a lot on the Jedi, who unravel the politics and situation.
I mean, do you care about the galactic trade routes? And yet the story opens by focusing on trade disputes instead of the characters who are affected by them.
Why do you have to show the Gungan city of all things? I thought they expressed plenty of reactions to the invasion through Boss Nass, who is arrogant enough to think the Gungans wouldn't be affected.
Remember how accessible the world building was in the original Star Wars? The reason for this is because the original does the legwork of getting us invested in characters before throwing world building details at us.
Isn't that just what the Phantom Menace did, just in a different way? Based on what I said earlier, the Jedi as the vessels to experience the story observe the conflict through their eyes. We see plenty of how the Trade Federation react to their own blockade, and we see soon after how Queen Amidala reacts, who we are informed is finally contacting the Trade Federation after refusing to speak with them. There's actually a ton of characterization. It's just not flashy and in your face. I think a common trend with prequel haters is that they don't observe the story as closely as I do. But when prequel haters talk about the story, it's clear they put no thought whatsoever into understanding the story and take everything at face value.
Right off the bat, we meet interesting people who represent both sides of the conflict. That helps us get invested in the story, and from there we learn what's at stake, we take in more details bit by bit, and we get a memorable demonstration of why the stolen data tapes are so important. Now compare that to Episode 1. At the start, we're expected to absorb tons of information. There's all this talk about trade routes and how Naboo will be affected, but why should we care about Naboo? We don't get invested in anyone from there until later.
So basically around the 20-minute mark then. It sounds to me, based on how this guy is describing the film on his own terms, that the Phantom Menace just has a bit of a problem with its opening, and it takes a while to pick up, which a lot of movies and stories in general can do, and still be awesome. Believe you me, I've encountered my fair share of stories in the Star Wars franchise that took maybe 20 minutes or so to pick up, before the rest of it was a breeze. For example, Tales of the Jedi and Star Wars Republic. Those two I didn't really have a high opinion of at first, but they picked up massively after they took the time to set up characters and conflicts. Now, would I make the same complaint about the Phantom Menace? Based on how I always experienced the movie, no, I wouldn't. The mysterious aura, and afterwards the jump into action as Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan are ambushed and sneak onto Naboo to find out the planet's being invaded, that was effective.
And this makes it harder to engage with the conflict, and although we might understand what's going on in this story world,
tell that to Red Letter Media. They would be like, huh? No, we don't.
The early details overpower the characters and flatten the emotion.
So basically his complaint is an overload of information, more or less. I don't know what he's talking about. I think prequel haters tend to think that just because topics like trade routes or blockades are very complex, at least for them, that means that they must have gone on and on and on and on about it. They didn't. I do remember someone told me once that they had to pause Attack of the Clones in order to soak in the politics properly, but the way it was described to me, I think the prequels are a complicated story rather than a bad one. I do see how the complex subject nature of the prequels might overwhelm someone who isn't expecting it, but that doesn't make the movie bad. In fact, there's a bunch of kids' movies that deal with complex subject matter, and kids probably won't understand the whys and hows until they grow older. I love how people mindlessly ripping on the prequels actually make me appreciate them more, because it's clear that they don't care to think about why things happened in the way that they did. I know for certain that George Lucas put a lot more thought into these movies, which is more than you can say for something like The Force Awakens, which was minimum effort for maximum reward. Anyways, moving on.
That brings us to Phantom Menace's second problem. It has a shallow, lifeless cast.
My first response to this is that the Phantom Menace is not a character-driven story, and the characters featured follow a bunch of basic archetypes. I'd say the most complex is unironically Qui-Gon, because as the main character who is absolutely the central POV, he has a lot of interesting ways of how he approaches situations. He embodies the values of a Jedi, but isn't afraid to bend the rules. Although he only resorts to bending, not breaking.
Not just in terms of the characters' personalities, but also their individual journeys. Personality-wise, everyone not named Anakin or Jar Jar is a walking sleep aid.
Yeah, I don't agree. Again, I watched this film a million times growing up. And I don't know about you, but I always managed to differentiate the characters alongside their journeys as you put it. Qui-Gon is a bit of a renegade who bends the rules, but his intentions are always pure. Obi-Wan is more of a traditionalist, obeying the council often. I would describe Padme as similar to Leia, a young but strong leader who takes charge, and so on. Yeah, the more I think about it, the more I realize that the Phantom Menace has a similar approach to its characters as A New Hope. I have to wonder if the problem people have with this movie is something else, and they could have just confused the characters lacking personalities, quote-unquote, as the problem.
Now, don't get me wrong, it's okay to have severe or stoic characters, but when most of the main cast brings the same energy, that's an issue.
Energy? What does that mean? I swear this is literally the same kind of argument Cosmotard Variety Hour made when he called the Phantom Menace boring, that the film had a lack of energy, but didn't really explain what that's supposed to mean. I know explaining why something is boring is sometimes difficult, but you gotta at least try.
To make matters worse, these characters don't offer much beyond their personalities.
I thought you said most of the cast was a walking sleep aid and didn't offer much personality.
Palpatine is the exception here because he's a schemer, he manipulates everyone in his quest for power, but aside from him, there's not much going on here.
You're joking, right?
Qui-Gon is pretty cool on the surface, but his actual character is lacking. He's intent on rescuing Anakin from slavery and training the boy, and this leads both of them to their eventual downfalls.
Okay, and what's the problem here?
Not a bad start, but my problem with Qui-Gon is that I always wanted more backstory out of him. Like, what drives this guy? Why is he so hell-bent on training Anakin, even when the Jedi Council refuses his request?
Sounds more like a petty personal gripe than actually something worth criticizing the movie for. This is the same kind of criticism someone makes when they whine that they don't know why the Trade Federation takes orders from Darth Sidious. Which is like asking why Darth Vader takes orders from Tarkin. Like, does the movie need to explain why the villain has henchmen? You can easily infer that Sidious, working in the shadows, managed to acquire power from within the Republic, which he does if you actually watch the movie. That's the whole point, and what's presented on screen. On Qui-Gon specifically, what is there to say about his backstory? He was given to the Jedi Order and raised in Jedi values, and eventually developed his own way of doing things. There's a lot more to Qui-Gon in something like the Jedi Apprentice novels, in which you learn shit like how he was in love with one of his fellow classmates named Tal, but that's not relevant to the movie whatsoever, or something like how Obi-Wan wasn't his first apprentice. I don't think either of those facts from the expanded universe would have been relevant or served any purpose in the story of the Phantom Menace.
The movie doesn't clue us in, and he feels shallow as a result.
This is a personal gripe of yours first and foremost, and you're acting like this is a problem with the movie.
Obi-Wan, meanwhile, is about as exciting as office work. Aside from his big moment at the end, he doesn't do much other than spin around and deflect gunfire. He's a Padawan who wants to complete his training, and for a good chunk of the movie, he rots away on the ship while other characters advance the plot.
Sounds like another petty gripe. Most of what Obi-Wan does is in unison with what Qui-Gon does. That's because they're on the same mission, and they've got a job to do. He also doesn't rot away on the ship for no reason. It's because someone's got to protect the Queen, at least officially. I don't even know what Brandon here is going on about. Qui-Gon is the main character, and obviously he's going to be the Jedi character that does more, especially since he's the Jedi Master and Obi-Wan is a Padawan. So obviously he has more responsibilities. Was there actually anything wrong with Obi-Wan backing up his master? The movie doesn't shift focus to Obi-Wan until midway through Duel of the Fates, where the POV changes from Qui-Gon to Obi-Wan. And we see Obi-Wan at the end left with the responsibility of training Anakin. I mean, did you miss the scene at the end where all the characters are gathered at the funeral of Qui-Gon Jinn? Which is basically symbolically the one who brought them all there in the first place?
Next we have Padme, who, despite her bland personality, is probably the best character outside of Palpatine. She's a queen who disguises herself as a handmaiden for her own safety, and this enables her to experience the world firsthand rather than sitting around a royal chamber.
Yeah, and that's where most of her characterization comes from. What's the problem here again?
Though she spends much of the movie in the background, she later leads an effort to recapture the throne room while displaying skill and resourcefulness in the process.
Yeah, what's the problem here?
Then we have Darth Maul, who's arguably the most stylish character in the entire film franchise. Trouble is, that's all he has. He's just style and nothing else, and he ends up being a throwaway villain.
Yeah, I don't know about you, but Maul ain't the main antagonist. I like the approach to make each of the supporting villains of the prequel trilogy foreshadow Anakin Skywalker's transformation into Darth Vader, which is why Darth Maul is designed the way he is. Also, given Dave Filoni's habit of dragging out characters until you get sick of them, I'd rather a character get cut short early rather than overstay their welcome. Also, I don't know about you, but I thought Darth Maul fits with the overall mystery of the film. I mean, it's called the Phantom Menace after all, and that's why the character has a lot of unknowns. I'm thinking back to the scene with Mace Windu and Yoda, where they literally speculate whether the Master or the Apprentice was destroyed. Moving on.
Then there's Anakin. He's portrayed as this innocent, compassionate kid, which is supposed to make his tragic downfall even more tragic. But ultimately, this portrayal leaves him feeling one-dimensional.
Heresy!
It would have helped if there was more darkness to his character, but we don't get that here. And it's a shame because even a little foreshadowing could have gone a long way.
On top of the fact that George Lucas littered these films with foreshadowing, I hate the point he's making. I think this guy doesn't understand that his character evolves and changes in between movies. Episode 1 is meant to show us the origin of the character, and how he basically started off as a kid, as kind and innocent as any other, who dreamed of a greater destiny outside of slavery. And I don't know about you, but wouldn't his life in slavery be a dark spot in him? That and his love for his mother that comes around later on, in the next movie. Because his arc doesn't just happen all in one movie. Yeah, sounds like a personal gripe more than anything. Not a very strong case he's making.
Finally, you have everyone else, including the Jedi Council, the Trade Federation, the Gungans, Padme's decoy, Anakin's mom, Watto, Sebulba, R2, and 3PO.
Yeah, what emotionless slogs, am I right? You should have just stopped at the Jedi Council, because they might have actually helped your case.
There are tons of characters crammed into this movie, and it leads to the age-old problem of quantity over quality. Cutting or combining some of these people would have allowed more time to develop the ones that actually matter, but in the end we're left with more characters than development.
Since all the characters you mentioned play a minor to supporting role at best, and only have maybe a few minutes of screen time each, interacting with the central characters, I don't know what you're talking about. The movie doesn't waste our time having too many characters in focus. Sebulba is just a supporting antagonist in relation to the Tatooine segment of the movie, and someone to root against when Anakin is pod racing, which everyone agrees is one of the best parts of the goddamn movie. I would argue that the Phantom Menace in actuality is very focused, and doesn't get sidetracked at all. When you consider the role and screen time of all the mentioned characters, I fail to see how this is a case of too many characters. That can certainly be a problem in certain stories, but I'd say something more like The Rise of Skywalker suffers from a problem like this, due to its rushed, unplanned nature and its general backtracking after The Last Jedi, not The Phantom Menace. Also, I don't know about you, but seeing how you're supposed to watch the films in chronological order, I'm not surprised the Phantom Menace introduced a lot of characters.
Finally, the third mistake is Phantom conflict. Episode 1 is full of this, and in several key moments, the movie plays out like a video game that beats itself.
What does that mean, a video game that beats itself?
Anytime an overwhelming obstacle threatens the characters, you can bet that convenient timing or a lucky coincidence will come to the rescue. For example, early on there's a scene where Qui-Gon, Obi-Wan, and Jar Jar are traveling in a submarine, and a giant sea creature attacks their ship. Jar Jar panics, but both Jedi act like it's no big deal, probably because they read the script and saw that a larger creature would eat their attacker.
There's always a bigger fish.
Wow. I would have thought that you would have omitted that line because it makes your argument look bad. Because Qui-Gon obviously knew that another sea creature was going to come and bail them out. I mean, Qui-Gon as a Jedi certainly has been around the block and can read situations better than most people.
This is a terrible scene and a blown opportunity. It could have juiced up the story with an exciting chase sequence, or it could have allowed the Jedi to come up with a clever solution, but instead the conflict eats itself.
Look, to be honest, this is probably the least memorable part of the movie for me. Maybe they could have just cut to arriving in Theed, but I don't see the problem with this. I have gone on record with the whole point that they shouldn't have made things too easy for the good guys, but given this is an inconsequential scene anyways, mostly used for character building and not part of the main conflict, it never really bothered me. I don't know. Maybe I will finally throw a bone at Brandon here because he made a kind of not rubbish argument. Congrats.
Then you have the movie's final act, which is full of Phantom conflict. Remember when the droid army threatens to wipe out the Gungans? Well, don't worry, because luck and coincidence repeatedly come to the rescue. Not only does Jar Jar kill numerous enemies with his Looney Tunes routine, but Anakin also plays an unexpected role in the battle.
Yeah, I have to point out for Jar Jar in particular, that while he clumsily takes out battle droids, he and the Gungans actually lose the battle and are forced to surrender, only to be bailed out in the space battle above. I think it actually plays real with the audience because it was presented comically, but showed us that cartoon antics aren't enough to win a battle. Far from.
See, the key to winning is destroying the droid's heavily guarded control ship. Anakin ends up doing just that, not because he has a plan or any intention of doing so, but because he accidentally triggers his ship's autopilot function, which takes him to the control ship, where he gets trapped inside and unintentionally destroys it.
Yeah, you forgot to mention that R2 was with him and was assisting him. You know, the really useful droid that saved everyone's skins earlier in the movie? I don't know. Whenever someone brings that up, I have to mention that the practicality of it all falls on R2. On the surface level, I'm pretty sure it's similar to the Jar Jar thing, where it's basically a kid's fantasy, imagining themselves in Anakin's shoes, taking on the Trade Federation. Also, just to point out, Anakin wasn't the only one piloting a starship in that battle, so I imagine that on top of R2's assistance, there were allies diverting attention. I don't know. I get why George Lucas did it, and it was certainly a self-insert for a kid to imagine themselves as Anakin. But there was a practicality in it all.
Finally, you have the duel between Obi-Wan and Darth Maul, which is intense and compelling until Maul has the high ground. From there, he somehow loses by allowing Obi-Wan to jump up and kill him.
The only complaint I have personally for this is that Obi-Wan's surprise attack was paced a bit too slowly, so it looks like Darth Maul was inattentive. Aside from that, I'm pretty sure it's accepted that Darth Maul was demonstrating the arrogance of the Sith, and didn't see Obi-Wan's attack coming because he thought that he was already beat. So despite Obi-Wan looking to the side, where Qui-Gon's lightsaber was, he didn't catch on to what he was doing. After all, right after Darth Maul was done with Qui-Gon, he immediately shifted attention to Obi-Wan, not paying a second's thought to the Jedi he slew the second before.
I mean, first of all, why doesn't Maul use the Force to push Obi-Wan to his death or throw something at him?
Wouldn't this criticism apply to literally every other Star Wars movie? Why didn't he just use the Force mid-battle? Is the most nitpicky complaint ever. And it can be easily inferred that most characters' Force focus was on lightsaber combat, and not using the Force directly. I noticed that in general, most characters who use the Force during battle are the more experienced characters, like Yoda, Darth Sidious, Count Dooku, etc. And the younger characters tend to stick to lightsaber combat. with a few exceptions.
And even if Maul is too dumb to figure this out, why don't his reflexes allow him to react to Obi-Wan's attack? If Maul can fight two Jedi at once, he should be able to see it coming when Obi-Wan leaps 20 feet in the air and grabs a lightsaber from across the room.
Yeah, I think what I said earlier applies here. Arrogance led to Obi-Wan seizing the opportunity because Darth Maul completely factored Qui-Gon and his lightsaber out of the fight post-defeating him.
I mean, come on. This fight deserves a better ending, and this franchise deserves better writing.
And finished. Yeah, I was really annoyed at this video, because it's clear he's not entrenched in discussion about Star Wars whatsoever, and clearly did not hear many of the defenses someone like me have for all these so-called problems. This video is so outdated that it was never indated, and what do you know? He has a video talking about Attack of the Clones as well. And I watched that too, and that reeks of outdated and misguided jabs at the prequels. But that's for another time. I'm JJ Plagiarisms. And until next time, what are stories but mystery boxes?
Under the mountain, a golden fountain. Were you praying that